Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Myers Jaffe. I am the Managing Director of the Climate Policy Lab here at the Fletcher School and a research professor. And I'm very pleased to be moderating this evening's discussion about the US Climate Leadership Summit. Lot to talk about, so I'm going to go right away to introduce our panelists. Our Dean of the Fletcher School, Rachel Kyte, is an expert in climate change and very well placed to comment on the summit. She served as the special representative to the UN Secretary General on climate change matters, and also served as Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Energy for All, C for All, a very admired institution that focuses on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and also has a long history working on climate change issues for the World Bank. She's joined by our academic dean and professor of energy and environmental policy here at the Fletcher School, Kelly Sims Gallagher, who is the director of Climate Policy Lab and as well as the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. And she has served in the past also on climate change issues in the US government, both as a senior policy advisor to the Obama White House in the second term, but specifically as an advisor on China matters in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change. So thank you both for being here today. Our format is going to be, we're going to have a structured session between myself and Kelly and Dean Kyte, and then we will open it up to you, the audience, to ask your questions. We will do the questions in two manners. One, you can feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will monitor the chat and look for them there. But you can also raise your hand, and which would give me the opportunity to call on you to ask your question in a live manner. We welcome everybody here today. We are recording because we'd like to be able to share our insights beyond today. And in today's world in social media, we'll have people who come to visit us here at the Fletcher School in the next few days, I'm sure, who'll be able to benefit from seeing the recording. So with that, eventful year in climate change. US is back in. We're going to spend some time thinking about, how much that matters and how it matters. And so I'm going to start with you, Rachel, and ask you, was the Climate Leadership Summit a success? And if so, how?
I think you can answer the question two ways. Was it a success from a United States perspective, and then was it a success from a global perspective? As many diplomats have told me from all over the world, they know more about US electoral systems and midterms than they've ever wanted to know. And so it was very important that on the campaign trail, President Biden indicated he was going to come back into climate. He frankly ran on climate, and he ran on climate justice, which was watched around the world. But there's more to this than just words. And so the action was necessary. And the most important sort of centerpiece that had to be delivered at this summit was the US's plan. Where would the US right-size its ambition? Would it be able to right-size its ambition? Now, of course, whatever they said at the summit has to move its way through the US legislative processes. But the whole world was watching, is he back? Is he back with an ambition which is appropriate for the race that we're all in now, which is a race to net zero by mid-century, which is what we would need to be at about 1.5 degrees of warming. So yes, he came with a plan. The plan was at the bottom end of where the right size of ambition needs to be. It was 52% reduction in emissions by 2030 over 2005 levels. And there's some very nice graphs out there that show you how that contributes to the global overall situation. I think there are some other things which were not quite so successful. But at the beginning of a year of climate diplomacy, it was perhaps too early. In diplomacy, everything has its moment. Things have to be ripe in order to be delivered. And so we saw a tightening of the commitments that have been made by major emitters. We saw Japan coming and saying that it was going to revise its target that it's handed to the UN as part of its nationally determined contribution. We saw the Koreans come and say that they would no longer finance coal overseas. We saw Canada tightening its target. And this is a result in large part of the US coming back with a very energetic diplomacy led by Special Envoy Kerry. The Chinese came and were positive, and I'm sure Dean Gallagher will talk much more about that. There were a couple of things that weren't there. Neither China nor Japan said that they would stop financing coal overseas. That's going to be fundamental. We can talk more about that. But the ratcheting up, the tightening of the screws, the fact that you have the US, the EU, and China all committed to the same sort of point on the horizon at around about the same moment in the century speaks volumes of the seriousness and the political alignment that perhaps can lead now to smoother, faster action globally.
So Kelly, let's get into the details. China's President Xi Jinping made several announcements at the summit. He pledged that China would control the increase in coal consumption and then begin to phase it down by 2030. New commitment or repeating his business as usual stance?
Definitely a new commitment, but it also is business as usual. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that actually for almost 20 years, the proportion of coal as a percentage of primary energy supply in China has been declining. 20 years ago, when I was doing my doctoral work in China, coal accounted for something like 72% of China's primary energy consumption. And the pledge for this year is that it'll account for 56%. And remember, China's grown dramatically during that time period, and its energy consumption has grown dramatically during that time period. So it has been hard work that represents a big diversification of their primary energy supply. And as we all know, they've added a huge amount of renewable energy capacity. In 2020, they added 72 gigawatts of new renewables, which is more than any other country. So I would say definitely a step in the right direction. My concern is that, it's going to be a really hard pathway for China actually to get to its 2060 net zero goal without peaking coal consumption pretty darn soon. So, his pledge that somehow the increase in coal would be controlled by 2030, that's actually 9 years from now. And so, probably they could increase the ambition there a little bit more. I think the really big news out of China was China's decision to accept the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. That is a big deal. China's the largest manufacturer of HFCs in the world. For those of you who may have forgotten this, HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, are a coolant, a refrigerant. They're regulated under the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And they're alternatives to CFCs, but they turned out to be really potent greenhouse gases. So China's acceptance of the Kigali Amendment is a big deal because this is one of those big non-CO2 gases that also needs to go to zero by 2050. And having China as part of that international agreement, and by the way, the United States is also committed to accept it now, is quite significant. I think that's a big deal. And the other big deal is China's decision to eliminate clean coal from the definition for a green bond. And Rachel may want to pick up on this, but I would say that's a big deal too. They considered clean coal as green, and a lot of wishy-washy stuff you know, was approved in the name of greenness. But, you know, from a climate point of view, most clean, so-called clean coal technologies really are not very clean. But China has a gigantic green bond market, I think the second largest green bond market in the world. So this is going to limit finance for coal domestically in China for sure.
Okay, Rachel, let me ask you, moving it ahead to a different topic, and then Kelly will come back to your some perceptions you might have about the US. COP26, we have the next formal rounds coming up. We've been delayed for a year. Let's hope we can have an in-person scheduled meeting next fall. Given what's happened with the climate summit and some of these announcements that you and Kelly have talked about, what do you think will be the focus at Glasgow?
So there you go again with the pronunciation.
Did I do it wrong?
No, nearly, it was very good. But one of the most important things that we learned at the Leaders Summit is that we are two nations divided by a common language. So I think in Glasgow, it's Glasgow, in London, it's Glasgow, and in Washington, it's Glasgow. But we will get there. And the point is, it's all about momentum. So this was the beginning step. The road from Washington to Glasgow goes through Cornwall, the G7, goes through Italy and the G20, in particular, a very important meeting in Venice, which is the finance meeting of the G20 in July. And then we have to go through a General Assembly where there are, I think in particular, low-income countries, the least developed countries will shout and scream if they feel that their needs are not being met in the process. There's a food summit. That's the way in which we produce food is an increasingly large percentage of emissions, but also key to resilience. And then we have a meeting in Kunming in China, which is the Nature Summit, the Convention on Biological Diversity in October. And then exhausted, we arrive in Glasgow in November. I was on a call this morning where the COP president, Minister Alok Sharma, said categorically, because there have been questions from Parliament, that there will be an in-person meeting. Now, how big, whether everybody goes, what the bubble is like and how vaccinations work, we don't know. But they are committed to, I think, some kind of hybrid meeting of some kind. So that does seem to be on. And just in the last couple of weeks, the Bureau, which is the countries that sit in charge of the process within the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, agreed that there would be virtual negotiations over the summer. And there'd been a standoff, frankly, for the last year about how virtual negotiations could take place. So we're running. Now, what are we running for? Every country has to come with its nationally determined contribution, which has to have much more ambition in it. There's a ratcheting up. Now, we would hope that when you add up all those nationally determined contributions, you get closer to 1.5 degrees of warming and net zero by 2050 than we are at the moment. But the point is, we are not going to get there. We are going to fall short. So how do you message that? And what do you say about that that doesn't sort of depress the global public even more and perhaps send signals to bad actors that this isn't so important? So there's mitigation. There has to be a lot said about how we're going to improve the adaptation and resilience capacity of the developing countries. And remember, this is all happening in a year of an extraordinary global downturn as a result of the pandemic. And there's a real feeling from least developed countries that they can't even get to the table, let alone really have their needs met. And then finance. And if I had one thing that sort of disappointed me a little bit about the summit last week was that the US came with the beginning of what its public finance commitments need to look like, but there is a whole second chapter that we're waiting for there. And frankly, the large emitters and the developed countries have to come with an extraordinarily large and creative way to use all public money to leverage private investment and to bring new forms of private investment to the table to fund the green, resilient infrastructure that developing countries need if they are going to stand any chance at all of surviving this transition. Politically, however, there's one thing that stands in the way of the pathway from Washington to Glasgow, and that is a global vaccination program. If there is not progress in the next few weeks and then at the G7 about a sizable global concerted effort to vaccinate the world, I think the politics of global climate change just become even more difficult.
Well, Kelly, let's turn it back to you. Let's turn our attention to Washington, D.C.
Before we get to Washington, can I just add a couple comments on the COP?
Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to reinforce a very important point that Rachel made, which is that this road through the G7 and the G20, I think that those are not just pit stops. Those are very important destinations in and of themselves, largely because of this climate finance issue. There are opportunities at both the G7, and I think maybe Rachel and I disagree on this, but I think even more profound at the G20 for getting all overseas development finance aligned. We need to be greening all overseas development finance. We need to be greening all overseas development aid. It's very important not only that that happens among the G7, but also it's important to get China on board with that program. They gave a positive hint, I think, in the US-China joint statement that came out, the Kerry-Xie joint statement right before the Leaders Summit, which sort of hinted at needing to work on this agenda of greening China's BRI, and for the United States really increasing the amount of green finance that it's providing through institutions like the Development Finance Corporation and the Exim Bank. And I noticed that USAID has pledged to release a new strategy, a new climate strategy in time for the COP. And so I think, all of these pieces are really important because the big issue at the COP, aside from increasing ambition, is climate finance and this perception that many developing countries have that the $100 billion pledge, which was supposed to be achieved by 2020, was not met, and that there's a gap. And so the question is, which institutions, which countries are going to step up and address that? And can we think about more creative delivery mechanisms like the debt for climate swaps or other mechanisms that we can really put on the table to provide a much more robust set of climate finance options for developing countries?
Okay, so give me a DC specific answer, quick, because we want to go on to other topics.
You mean next steps for the Biden administration post summit?
Yeah, what's the next biggest thing you think they should do?
Well, I think a pledge is a pledge. And, I think we saw that there was a fair amount of international skepticism about the United States. It was very important that the Biden administration provided an ambitious target. And now the question is, can they deliver on it? What is the strategy for actually getting the United States back on track to actually achieve its Paris target, the 26 to 28% below 2005 levels, much less getting on track to achieve the 50 to 52%. And I think I noticed in the fact sheet that was released by the White House that they state that they intend to release a climate strategy ahead of COP26. That'll be important. I mean, that's really the detailed roadmap for how you actually get these emissions reductions, policy by policy. I believe that the United States needs to look seriously at climate legislation. It can be done through a patchwork approach. Maybe the American Jobs Plan, and then, sort of infrastructure bill, and then pieces, dribs and drabs, or we could take a more comprehensive approach. It's going to be important for the United States to be able to articulate a detailed strategy that's durable, so that the United States isn't quite so vulnerable to the wild policy swings that other countries have started to realize occur from administration to administration, for them to believe that the United States is going to honor its targets.
So Rachel, let's talk about comparative climate policy. the climate summit was all in the news. And so those of us here on this side of the ocean barely noticed that the European Union has agreed to a new climate change law. And that includes the 55% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, below 1990 levels, and then net zero for 2050. Still needs to go through some approval processes. And of course, everybody's wondering, is it or does it have carbon border adjustments that have been debated in the media in it or not in it? In or out?
No, there's a proposal on the table for carbon border adjustment, which I'll come to in a minute, but it's a very significant, extremely significant moment because it enshrines in law the target that was suggested last year by the Commission. And it means that you've got all 27, including Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, and you've got the European Parliament all agreed. So, you know, that's from your greenest green all the way to your MP from Silesia, right? So that's profound and is a cementing in of the goal and the ambition. So now the European Union can now look at exactly how it's going to go, sort of put its hands underneath the hood of the European economy and start fiddling around to make sure that that happens. And that's where the carbon border adjustment comes in. And I think that I think one of the fears is that we may have a political alignment around net zero and an alignment around the kind of speed which we have to hit milestones by 2030 between China, the EU, and the US. But there actually has to be a coming alongside or a shared approach to key elements within economic policy making. One would be on the trade regime and how we treat the movement of carbon between different trading blocks. The second is on the taxonomy of sustainable finance. So how do and also then in addition to that, sort of what we mean when we call things green. So there's no point having a definition of green hydrogen in the United States, a different definition of green hydrogen in the European Union, and a different again definition of green hydrogen in China or Japan, if we're trying to build rapid global markets for the benefit of everyone. So the taxonomy around finance, it really is about what can count as sustainable finance. The People's Bank of China and the EU are in conversation. Now, of course, Janet Yellen is sitting in charge of the oversight committee across the entire US economy, with now a climate counselor appointed within the US Treasury, John Morton, who used to be in the White House and was at OPIC, and so has extraordinary and has been in the private sector, so understands how these things work. So hopefully now with the Federal Reserve joining the club of central banks, really committed to thinking this through, the SEC now putting out for consultation issues around transparency and disclosure and more, the US can come alongside. So really, I think that, you know, what we need to see is these major blocks coming alongside with at least a similar approach, if not a joint framework for how we manage finance, how we manage trade, and how we manage standard setting.
So Kelly, realistic for the United States to organize a trilateral position on that between the United States, the EU, and China, or other trade problems and the pandemic get in the way?
I think the U.S.-China dynamic is a difficult one right now, and we saw that with former Secretary Kerry, I guess we call him Special Envoy Kerry's meeting with Minister Xi Jinping in China. But I think we're on the right path because the very first step is to just have the conversation and start the conversation, break the ice, and that finally happened. Kerry's trip to China was actually the first trip by a Biden administration official to China. I think that was significant. It signaled that climate was really important to the Americans in the US-China relationship. And, you know, they clearly had a robust set of discussions and started to learn what the constraints were on both sides. And that is the first step. We shouldn't expect you know, anything magical to happen overnight. A lot of trust was broken over the last 4 years that needs to be rebuilt. But I do think the EU has a really crucial role to play. And really there is potential for some trilateral cooperation, particularly around overseas development finance. But the EU all along has been maintaining these conversations with China, and has advanced a lot of issues with China. And of course, then can help loop the United States in. The challenge, of course, in terms of the EU-US conversation is that the EU is seriously considering a border tax. And now that they will have passed climate legislation in the EU, it makes the lack of climate legislation in the United States all the more glaring.
And I would add to that, you know, having focused on the energy piece myself, that the Biden administration has yet to rule down on how they're going to handle methane leakage and other kinds of methane practices in the US oil and gas industry. And that could be a major issue between the EU and the United States on carbon border adjustment. So early days on that in terms of, I think the Europeans are looking for coordination on the US side, and the president has some political constraints in how fast he can move on that issue here in the United States. So difficult tightrope to watch here on how to move all these moving pieces. And as Kelly, you mentioned with China's finance and our finance, and can we, you know, what can the United States do in terms of its contribution to finance? And also we want to be participating in green finance and try to, if not compete, at least substitute for BRI finance that's going to coal and other kinds of industry that is not moving in the right direction. So any last comment on, you know, that sort of financial piece? Again, a difficult challenge for the US and with the China relationship.
Wait, just one thing, sorry.
Go ahead.
So just one thing on finance. So outside of the sort of statements that the president made last week and the very fast work that we see happening across the government, there were these sort of non-governmental commitments that were being made. And this is within the, out of the UN process, this is called the race to zero. It's been branded the race to zero, but it's really about the private sector and coalitions of government and private sector making commitments as well. Now, they contain the good, the bad, and the ugly. So there is a real risk that some of it is, you know, may end up being greenwashing, while people work out what are the guardrails and the rules around this sort of stuff. But I think last week everybody was just heady with the idea that people were going to be making commitments to things. But there was a Glasgow financial alliance for net zero, which was targeted at banks. Some of the banks in that alliance already have made commitments and are on a policy pathway. Frankly, some of the banks that joined that alliance have got no policy, haven't even got any sort of timelines. And so I think, you know, if they haven't got themselves organized by Glasgow, hopefully they get thrown out of those alliances. But the pressure is really there. But you also saw John Kerry announce that the US was going to join the LEAF coalition. This is a very serious science-based coalition around high quality forest assets that could be used in offsetting. And what offsetting is the idea that you may be able to reduce your emissions. You may have some residual emissions that you can't prevent, in which case you may be able to buy the capacity of some other entity or asset in some other part of the world to offset those emissions. Now, there is some real skepticism about the enthusiasm for offsets from the oil and gas industry and from big banks. And in fact, I think we may have committed the forest resources of Malawi 5 times over in the last 2 to 3 weeks. So there is going to be a big push, and observers can watch for this in the next 6 months, a big push around integrity. How do we know if you're saying that you're on the road to net zero that you really are? Who will be the judge of that? Who's going to be the jury of that? And who decides? So lots of private financial actions to watch for as well.
Okay, Kelly, you want to give us a last word on the US and finance, and then we have fabulous questions in the chat.
I was just going to make a slightly different point, which is that one area where I see some real alignment between the US and EU is a big push on infrastructure. That's clearly Biden's, main plan. That is his approach to the climate problem, is a big investment in low carbon infrastructure and industry, in infrastructure, soft and hard, people and transmission wires and electric vehicle charging stations and so forth. And he's proposed, literally trillions of dollars of new investment. And that is well aligned with Europe's Green New Deal. And I think that there's a lot to be, worked on together and learned from each other, as both continents start going down this kind of big push infrastructure pathway. And a lot of developing countries will be looking at that as they pursue infrastructure-led development. And that's sort of the segue to how do we help all of those rapidly developing countries that want to build out their infrastructure, do it in a clean and green way, so that they're not replicating, a carbon intensive infrastructure that the United States at least is trying to get rid of and replace, but do it right the first time around. And I think there's a really important role for United States, Europe, Japan, and others in the G7 to play. But I also think major emerging economies like China, who are looked to as role models for infrastructure-led development.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to the questions in the chat because they're quite good. So Tom Stanton asks, and we've addressed this a little bit, but I like the way he directed his question. Can you please address what is happening in decisions about the Sustainable Development Mechanism at COP26 and what we know about the future of greenhouse gas emission reduction offsets and the potential for beneficial uses? Rachel, why don't you go first?
So I think this is an Article 6 question. So one of the things that has to happen in Glasgow is that there's a bunch of issues that have got basically the can was kicked down the road since Paris, and they need to be squared away, tidied up, and clarified. And one of those is what we call Article 6, and this is the article in the Paris Agreement that deals with markets. How do you create and regulate and build the rules for markets that would allow for carbon to be traded? There are deep disagreements about how to do that. These disagreements involve the way that Brazil looks at the way it can use its extraordinary stock of forests in such a trading, and there have been traditionally a difficult debate between the EU and China. Of course, the US has been on the edge of this for the last 4 years. I think, and Kelly can speak more to the Chinese position, but I think that the early signs were that China would like to get some kind of a sense of an agreement on this, and so that it wasn't a stumbling block, because there were many other things that it wanted to be able to move domestically. And I think that the entrance of the US back into the debate, and with the US with a slightly different view around trading than the European Union, and a sort of an attempt by the Europeans to sort of say, hey, we have an approach, why don't you come and join us in this approach? And the initial rejection by Special Envoy Kerry and saying, no, we're going to develop our own views. And also, I think there's a timing issue. The EU, I think, would like to sort of move this forward now. The US has said, hey, don't do this now, wait until after Glasgow. And so there's a lot of intensive diplomacy needed across the Atlantic, so that this doesn't actually trip a lot of other things that need to happen up. So, I mean, Kelly, I'm sure you've got an additional perspective.
No, I think, Article 6, which is all about international trading of, permits essentially to emit or offset emissions. There's two big issues here. The first is the offset issue and the environmental integrity question. How can we be sure that these offsets are real, particularly as they're counting against, these net zero targets. And as Rachel has argued eloquently in her recent op-ed in the Washington Post, we need to be clear about what net zero means, and it needs to be real and not filled with dubious offsets. So I think the environmental integrity issue is a really big one, really important. And then the second issue around Article 6 is the question of whether we're going to tax these transactions. So if Brazil gets paid for an offset, is that transaction going to be taxed? And if so, what will we do with the money? And a lot of least developed countries, highly vulnerable countries, have argued that those transactions should be taxed and should be then dedicated to adaptation or to loss and damage. So these are both hard issues, right? They depend actually a lot on science and monitoring and verification. And then also they depend, that it sort of reflects a big concern that developing countries have, that there isn't going to be enough support for them as they are trying to adapt to rapid climate change, particularly, countries from the Alliance for Small Island States who really feel like their whole countries depend on us getting this right. So allowing a lot of unreal offsets doesn't solve the problem. Sea level continues to rise. Not providing enough funding for adaptation and resilience, they may not be able to sustain a viable country altogether if sea level rise happens too fast for them to be able to take the measures that they need to take to protect their shorelines.
Oh my God, there's so many good questions in the chat. I'm getting stressed out. So because we're academics, I'm going to go to Emily Dowell's question first. She wants to know what role you both see in the way academic research in the coming months can inform policy leading up and following Glasgow.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Well, I think there's fundamental academic work on governance. We're entering into a new era where technologically we can put an eye in the sky and we can know what the point source emissions are of any power plant in the world. We can know what the methane flares are, and we can know whether a forest is really there or not. But the technology on its own, without a governance framework and without policy, is suboptimal. And so it is untenable for most developing countries to have the technology that allows you to do that available to somebody sitting in Silicon Valley or Boulder, Colorado, or Medford, and not be available to them in real time and not have their ability to have their voice heard at the table. So I think there's extraordinary room for academic research there. There's all of the, frankly, without the academy, we wouldn't be where we are in terms of understanding how to bend the emissions around methane and short-lived climate pollutants. Tomorrow, we will see the announcement of who has won the Global Cooling Prize. This was defined by academic researchers from multiple institutions working with think tanks around the world. And this is the challenge was to be able to come forward with a way to offer cooling at a price point of a low middle class Indian family that would be 5 times more efficient than anything on the market, and that would be HFC free, right? So these kinds of things, so from the really technical specificity of the race to zero through to how do we govern this, I think the academy is deeply involved. And of course, when we come to finance and the remodeling really of the global economy so that its lifeblood is not carbon dioxide emissions, the academy is all over that issue as well.
The only other thing I'd add is just to say, here at the Fletcher School, we have the Climate Policy Lab, and our whole mission is to determine which policies work, which don't, and why. And this is, in fact, a big question as countries are trying to figure out what targets can, how can we increase ambition? The question they're asking themselves is, well, what policies could we put in place that would deliver on these targets? And they're going to be more conservative about those targets if they don't feel confident that policy X or Y or Z will work to actually get those emissions reductions in the time, allotted. So I still think there's a lot of work to be done, which we're trying to, tackle in the Climate Policy Lab to help understand under what conditions do certain policies work and not work, and why.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that in the following way with a great question in the chat. So one of the things we're doing this year in Climate Policy Lab is, and we have a blog today on our blog, Climate Smart, that talks about that in the Indian context, is look at the alignment between stimulus, green stimulus, climate ambition, and vulnerability and fairness, both within countries and in the global system. So I have a follow-up question from Samini Sengupta for you, Rachel. She said, you've spoken of the need for vaccine access for Glasgow to work. I wonder if inequality in vaccine access might be seen by the most vulnerable countries as a signal of inequity in the climate space. So who can afford to go green and who can't? How do we address that?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the problem. I mean, sort of in the brute politics of it, you can't ask people to come to a global discussion around growth over the next decade if access to a vaccine for a global pandemic is not available. Right? I think that it's quite stark in that respect. But there is, apart from the sort of that very sort of right now, right here dimension, we're in a situation where the breadth and the depth of the global slowdown as a result of the pandemic is unprecedented in modern economic history. There is a very real risk that the countries that are a little bit richer and have done better through the pandemic will recover, once they've got vaccine levels up, will start to recover. Whereas those who are a little poorer and are having a harder time and are mired in a liquidity crisis at the moment will actually not do so well, and that we will have greater divergence, which is extremely difficult to manage politically, but is also deleterious to sort of the idea that we're one planet and we all need to come back greener. So I agree that the G20 is very important, and that China and India now join the table of investors and the sort of sources of support and guidance on how poorer countries will embark on their energy transition. But I think that there is a moral as well as political as well as economic role for the G7 to play, because we caused the problem. And I think when you hear the Secretary General talking about solidarity and talking about the need for a financial package, he's got his eye on the G7. So if they don't come up with something, it makes it even more difficult for the G20 to come up. Now, what should they come up with? Frankly, a commensurate offer for investment in green infrastructure, commensurate to what the Belt and Road Initiative has been doing over the last decade or more. It hasn't necessarily been green enough, but it showed a solidarity and an interest in infrastructure development. I think we have to get back into that game, and we're going to have to put enormous amounts of resources available to the resilience and the adaptation necessary, also the disaster response, because we've baked the climate impact in already. And even if we stopped emitting today, the intensified extreme weather events are going to continue. The impact on the drought cycle, the impact on food, etc. That's there. And honestly, the sort of money on offer at the moment, we haven't ever hit any of the targets that we've promised in any of the international agreements over the last 10 years. And so you can understand why the developing countries come to the table and say, you don't deliver once, well, shame on you. You don't deliver twice, shame on me for ever believing that you would. And I think what developing countries are asking for now is access to the capital markets at a reasonable price. They're asking for the new allocation of funds that went to the IMF to be reallocated and to flow to them quickly, not, in August or October and November. They have to purchase vaccines now. So I think that there's an urgency around the economic recovery. And if that isn't in play over the summer, I think it makes Glasgow extremely difficult.
Okay, now there's a bunch of questions in the chat, changing subjects, that look at this question of fossil fuels. So I'm going to start with Tim Morris' question. Somebody mentioned in the chat, apparently the US Senate passed a bill like minutes ago to try to re-regulate methane leakage in the United States. So interesting to know before I ask Tim Morris' question, then we can kind of talk a little bit about this. He asks, how can the US lead when its large private financial institutions, and he puts in parentheses, who talk a good game, continue to fund on large scale even more sources of fossil fuels, when we already have at least 4 more reserves than we can burn if we hope to have a sustainable globe? So he says, how are these institutions brought in the fold?
Rachel, this is you.
Oh, well, first of all, I think that, there's a couple of things that are happening which I think will start to have greater impact. First of all, both the EU and the UK are running pilots for stress testing of banks. What that means is that if you're banking in their jurisdiction, you will have to disclose the carbon carbon in your asset portfolio, and your plans for, and your transparency around that, and your plans for how to maintain your business if you're holding on to what will be a stranded asset. We would expect that the US will follow suit, and I think the work on that is already beginning. So you're going to find yourself regulated, and you're not going to want to be holding an asset which is of no value. That's one thing. Second thing, you're starting to see some very serious investors start to be very clear that they will be removing non-executive directors and directors of companies if they do not understand or behave in a sort of climate responsible way. And Chris Hone, who is one of the largest hedge fund managers in Europe, based out of London, has fired a series of warning shots and has an awful lot of support. And so you're going to start to see the removal of directors of companies and banks if they are not being climate smart in terms of shorthand. So I think there is a bit of a pincer movement going on here. But it's true. At the moment, you've got some banks who are really working through what it means to be net zero. You've got vehicles and sort of people looking at maybe even creating sort of bad asset banks. I mean, how do you get rid of your bad assets? I mean, and then eventually, then where do they go? And then you've got, I think, banks sort of saying that they're net zero, but not really knowing what that really means. And then, frankly, you've got some saying that they are net zero and they've got really no process even up and running internally to sort of really work out what it means. And so they'll be chased in from all directions, I think, and from consumers and from young people, but also from investors and then from regulators.
And if I can just add, the US actually does need to lead with its public finance institutions. So for one thing, the Development Finance Corporation needs to make good on this new pledge that they're going to spend 1/3 of their capital on climate-related investments. That's a pretty big number. I see Paolo Cozzi's question in the Q&A that the U.S. climate finance pledges seem sort of anemic. Well, 1/3 of 60 billion. There's a 60 billion authorization for the Development Finance Corporation. That's 20 billion right there. So that's a good start. And then I think the United States really needs to pass a green bank. We need a green bank. It's been proposed in a number of different formats. There's different bills in Congress, and I think that's another way that it can set a good example for the private sector, and it actually can catalyze the private sector if we had such a public finance institution.
Okay, I'm going to pivot to Gardner Hill's question, since we're sort of focused on the private sector, and Rachel sort of set out this framework that the public and shareholders and others, institutional money is increasingly focused on the private sector's role. So Gardner agrees that the private sector has an important role, and he asked the following question: are organizations like Sciencebased targets creating a useful framework which can work internationally?
Yeah, I think the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is a conglomeration of a number of think tanks and business NGOs, for those of you who don't know it. And basically what they're saying is that if you're making a commitment, you have to adhere to a science basis for your target, and that you have to report against that, and that has to be sort of validated. So your commitment to net zero, your commitment to where you want to be by 2025 or 2030 has to be science-based. And I think that that's critically important, because that is one of the guardrails to greenwashing, or guardrails to sort of a hyperventilation around net zero and the debasing of that concept. And you know, there's been some interesting commentary since the summit around net zero as a concept. I mean, I think it is, I mean, frankly, in 2014, in 2013, I sat in a kitchen table in an undisclosed location with a bunch of sort of climate leaders, and somebody said, you know, shouldn't we really be talking about 1.5, and shouldn't we be talking about net zero? And half of us laughed and said, that's preposterous. And here we are just 7 years later with the idea cemented in the public imagination. And I think that should not be discounted, but it has to be real, or we lose the fact that we actually have a galvanizing idea. And that idea has sort of cemented itself in the, I think, in the boardrooms and in the C-suites of many businesses. So science basis for a net zero commitment, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Now, these groups need to be able to withstand the pressure. And I think at the moment they've sort of set out the targets, but then who sits in judgment of whether your target really is science-based, and whether or not you're really on the road to that? I mean, that's basically from voluntary disclosure at the moment. You're going to see that kind of thing move from the voluntary space to the mandatory space, I think, through regulation of companies and of banks. Now, that will be fought quite hard on this side of the Atlantic. It's a much more accepted concept in Europe, but even so, that's the journey, I think, over the next few years.
Okay, I'm going to end us up, because we're almost out of time, with William Mamo's point, and stay on, come back to this question of, you know, negative emissions, carbon sinks, you know, that final part of net zero that people somehow have trouble understanding or working from. And he makes the point that everybody's focused on forest protection in Brazil, but how about harvesting in the United States? So the question is, Kelly, if you have an opinion, will the United States get this sort of carbon sink question correct in the United States? Do you see that as something that's too esoteric to be addressed here in the United States? And then there's another question in the chat, which I think is relevant to that. So we're starting to get to the point where we have satellite and other very sophisticated technology to do verification. And it won't just be a company making a voluntary announcement. There might be somebody up there with a photograph of whether the carbon sink is still there and if it's permanent and so forth. So how do you see that playing out? Will people accept that verification process? Can we get to a global agreement on verification? And will the United States be apocryphal? Will we want verification everywhere else, but not in New Hampshire?
Well, let me first tackle that with a U.S. lens. It has long been recognized in the United States that we have a lot of uncertainty about our sinks. And in fact, back in the Obama administration, and this was published in the U.S. biennial report, there was so much uncertainty, it could have swung the US target by 6 percentage points, you know, out of the 26 to 28. So I think there's important science that continues to need to be done, but we already have learned a lot since then. And I think in particular, satellite-based measurements offer enormous potential for us to be able to, in a pretty granular way, literally see what's going on, right? That's underpins the whole program that the US and Norway and other, I can't remember who was the third country, the LEAF coalition.
UK.
That underpins the whole performance-based payment system in that program. You're not going to make a payment until you can verify, you know, that there's been reduced deforestation and therefore reduced emissions. There's no better place for us to get good at doing these measurements than right here in the United States against our own target. So if we can't get this right here, shame on us. We have world-class science institutions, our science agencies like NASA and NOAA with tremendous satellite capabilities. We have organizations like our partner, the Woodwell Climate Research Center, that are really getting really good at this. So we ought to be able to do better, as Bill Muma knows well. I think it's incumbent on us to start getting these measurements right and doing rigorous, careful accounting. This is actually one of the last remaining issues in the Paris rulebook, is finalizing the rules around transparency. And so it's critically important to get this right.
Well, we have 1 minute left. I want to thank everybody who put a question in the chat. They were really fantastic questions. We've had a great discussion. We did not get to the topic, Kelly, your favorite topic of technology innovation. So we promise that we will come back with a new session sometime soon, maybe with a technology and climate focused session. So we thank everybody for coming today. Dean Kyte, do you have a last minute comment before we say goodbye?
No, just that we're in the thick of this in terms of our engagement in the policy debate at the multilateral level and at the national level, and in the track 1.5 and 2 conversations. Our postdocs and our PhDs are doing path-breaking research, which is going straight into policy briefs. Our master's students are right in the thick of this, whether they're looking at climate from a security perspective or a human security or an energy technology policy or a business perspective. And so let's do more of these, and we hope to be able to keep the pulse of the journey from Washington to Glasgow over the next few months. And please come back and join us again. Amy, thank you.
Thank you very much to Kelly and Rachel Kyte. We'll see you soon.